Alright, so we try to focus in class a lot on the issues of the war itself, kind of how it got started, and what's happening to the soldiers, those kind of things. We're going to use this video here to talk about the home front issues happening in the North and the South during the Civil War. So, first big thing is the North needs a draft. Okay, in 1863 they instituted a draft to say all people that are able need to come and enlist. Here's why, okay? After Battle of Antietam, 1862, Matthew Brady, who we looked at his pictures in class, or looked at his pictures in class, published all his pictures of the dead in the battlefield. So sunken road, all that kind of stuff. All his picture posted of dead bodies in newspapers. That means that people are all of a sudden seeing, look, war. It's not romantic. It's not exciting, and they don't want to enlist anymore. And all the volunteers are getting kind of dries up to a degree. I mean, people still volunteer for the war. Don't get me wrong. Still volunteer a lot, but not as many as they were before. So the Union needs more soldiers. Remember, they also have a 2.5 to 1 advantage in terms of people, so they can bring more people in. So the draft is instituted. It says that all men age 18 to 35 need to report to the cities for physical. They can see if they're going to be in the military or not. By the way, not many of the people actually were drafted actually went in the military, and here's why. There are tons of ways around the draft. One is a medical issue. Okay, if you have any kind of disability or illness or history of illness, then boom, not in draft. Occupation. If you could not leave your job, if your job was so important, say you're the only person on a farm, or if you're the only person in a store, your job was super important, especially for the war effort, they said you can stay. If you're the only son, so yeah, make sure that you can inherit land, that kind of stuff. If you're the only son, you could stay as well. The other way you got out of it is by paying what's called paying for a substitute. So by paying for a substitute, you would take a certain amount of money, $50 or $100. You would pay somebody to go to the draft for you. So if you were hard up for money and you were drafted, you could pay somebody to take your spot instead. And a lot of rich people did that, and a lot of poor people who needed money took advantage of that and went and fought in the war as a substitute instead. So here's a little thing. You want to substitute by way of military service. You can grab any person you could who's down their luck if you were drafted and rich and pay them to take your spot instead. Now, this leads to draft riots, and here's why. It just ticked people off in general. They thought it was against their rights to be drafted. So they started demonstrating the draft, marching, chanting, all that kind of stuff. Okay, the people who don't like this are the ethnic groups. So a lot of Europeans left Europe because their pacifists didn't believe in war, like a Thoreau type guy, or they left Europe because of the draft and required military service and felt it wasn't right. And so you see a lot of these riots happen in big cities. And they happen in all cities. They happen in New York, happen in Milwaukee. There were draft riots. Chicago, there were draft riots. Everywhere who kind of protest against the idea of draft. And what happened was they brought the federal military in. They kicked you off the streets and shut the riots down with the military. Now this leads into the idea of emancipation, 1863, late 1862, and then taking effect on January 1st, 1863. Remember, Lincoln losing the war, right? Needs a way to inspire the Union in the war, and so Emancipation Proclamation is issued, freeing slaves in everywhere but the border states. Remember, these are the states that are in rebellion right now, is where people are freed, and so it made the war about slavery and reuniting the country, not just reuniting the country anymore. Now we're fighting for slavery as well. And in a way, this works for some. A lot of people get inspired now. African Americans allowed to fight in the military, all that kind of stuff happens. But there's also another problem now too, is that some people who are protesting the draft feel that the war is fought for African Americans. So now you see people here who are wondering here's your bounty, right? Here's what you're getting paid for new recruits, right? $300 for your bounty, all that kind of stuff. You hand money out to new recruits, bring recruits in, you're making money by bringing Irish people in, trying to bring people into different cities. You also had recruiting African Americans for the war now too, and bringing them into the conflict. That also led to some fights in New York. So the New York City draft riots happened in July of 1863, excuse me, and it was about African Americans because now a lot of people that were protesting the draft in New York City thought the war was being fought for African Americans, so they started attacking the African Americans that live in New York City. So you see these breakout by A here, and all of a sudden these kind of snake through New York City. You have a speech by the governor, barricades are stormed by the police who are protesting, and eventually there's confrontation between soldiers and rioters in Gramercy Park happens over here. But this is all about African Americans. You can almost kind of see all the people that are being attacked here are African Americans because they're being blamed now for the war. And it's almost like a pogrom, almost like an attack on African Americans where lynchings happen, that kind of stuff, because people who don't want to fight the war are blaming African Americans for this whole thing going down. And so it's kind of interesting to see how the two sides of this whole thing look. Where in some ways it inspires some people to go fight, other people are angry because now we're fighting for a different reason they don't necessarily agree with. And so that's kind of where this whole thing rolls in. So with this whole emancipation idea happening in the draft, we start seeing African American soldiers become a big part of the new lexicon for the Union Army. A lot of African Americans want to sign up now. They want to free fellow African Americans who are currently slaves. The only issue is that they weren't allowed to be officers in the army. So while there could be the regular private soldier, they could not be an officer. So you had units that were all African American, but all the officers, the upper officers were all white officers. So they're not, and early on, not giving combat assignments either. So a lot of times they weren't put in combat, but they're allowed to do things like cooking, labor jobs, building jobs, construction jobs, those kind of things. And one example of the first unit that really got a lot of notoriety was the 54th Massachusetts, which was an all-black regiment out of Massachusetts that would be the first allowed into combat. There were other units as well. There was a Kansas group that formed in 1862. Those were escaped slaves that were out there. And a lot of times, really, the support for these black troops didn't come until after the Emancipation Proclamation. Fred Douglass always really talked a lot about African American troops and really encourage African American troops to happen. The idea that we're fighting a war now that involves slavery, it should be for African Americans to help in that war effort. And so we see an image of the 54th Massachusetts here, the different soldiers that fought in it. You see the white officers versus the regular soldiers who were African American. Now, African Americans could be sergeants, so the highest ranking enlisted man, but they could not be counted as an officer, like a lieutenant or a captain or a major general, those kind of things. For the South, in terms of these African American soldiers, they made a policy that African American soldiers would not be taken as prisoners; they'd be killed. So if you're captured as an African American soldier, you'd be executed, and if you were a white officer commanding those, you'd also be executed as well, and punished as somebody who was trying to free slaves. In fact, you have Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, who, when an African American unit was captured at Fort Pillow, massacred them all. They were all killed. And so that was one of the things that kind of comes back on his African American soldiers about what the punishment could be for them if they are captured in combat. They weren't going to go to a POW camp. Instead, they're going to go to a gallows and be killed instead. Like I said, you hear the scene from the movie Glory. The movie Glory is about the 54th Massachusetts. Great movie, by the way. I encourage you all to watch that one. But they are the first group that really saw combat. And we knew a lot about them because of the captain that was in charge, the officer in charge of their regiment. Of the unit, he wrote a lot of letters home to his family, and those are actually kept at Harvard and were published in numerous books. Those things. They did fight a lot at different battles in Florida and South Carolina. A lot of them died at Fort Wagner, which was a fort that the Union never took. And a lot of them are actually interred nearby there, along with their officers. So when an officer was killed with these African American soldiers, they were buried with them. For the South, it was supposed to be a sign of disrespect, but a lot of times the families of the officers who died chose to see it as a sign of them being buried with their men and supporting the movement that a lot of these officers believed in. Last thing we're going to look at here is the role of women at this time. So you can see Harper's Magazine, Harper's Weekly, which kind of shows what women are doing now during the war and how the women kind of played a role in the Civil War here. So, for a lot of times, life must go on. Women took on a lot of the work that men were doing. So whether it be in some of the factories or in the fields, as men were gone fighting, women took those roles on. So whether it be covering for husbands or brothers, whoever, they took on a lot of those jobs now. Some women, and it's very famous stories, actually disguised themselves and fought in the war, using bandages and wigs and those kind of things as a way to go and fight in the conflict because they felt so strong about it or wanted to be treated the same as men did. Family-wise, too, is interesting. A lot of families actually follow the war. So they had what are called camp followers, where sometimes a soldier would go off to war and his family would literally follow behind the army camp. So you see these camp followers, and they would follow the army and do work, that kind of stuff for them. Kids and women would wash clothes, those kind of things for these guys who are in the army. And sometimes, whole families would just follow you right along to war and follow right behind the camp as they went from place to place to place. You can see the kids during this time of the war going to school, things staying kind of common. A lot of times kids had to step up, though, and do work of adults because, so they had to provide for the family and keep things going. some little children went to fight as well. You could join as some joined as young as 12, 13, 14 years old, usually as drummers and musicians, those kind of things. But sometimes they end up in combat. So Johnny Cook, who ends up getting a Medal of Honor and Antietam because he put down his drum and fired a cannon instead. Um, we have women who serve as nurses and stuff. She helped the wounded at Gettysburg. At this point, men were mostly all nurses yet. Um, and so she published her book and stuff about her experiences taking care of soldiers and stuff in an informal way. Slaves, same deal, had to keep on with life and stuff, even though things are going on around them. Until Union soldiers came, they were still slaves and were actually encouraged to work for the Confederate Army and help them out, those kind of things. These are hard times for a lot of people. Both North and South had a lot of economic problems at this time. And here you have Scott's Anaconda Plan. They had a big blockade here to choke off goods to the South. So a lot of food and a lot of things that weren't taken care of in the South weren't necessarily available to them because everything went to the war effort. And it really drove prices up pretty crazy. Because the South was having trouble paying off debts, those kind of things, they printed off currency. Like they printed off Confederate currency like nobody's business, which created huge inflation. So for the South here, what would cost you $1.25 in 1860 now cost you $10. And so these prices went through the roof, especially for goods they could not get, they could not grow there. Things like coffee and sugar and those kind of things just went through the roof and increased all prices everywhere. So there's extreme inflation that hit the South and made economic troubles really, really terrible for those living there. There were shortages of bread and coffee and everything else that people needed to live. And there were actually bread riots that took place in Richmond because there wasn't enough food for people to go around. Not only was the food bad for soldiers, but there wasn't enough food for women, children, men who were at home as well. And as this whole idea of total war kind of becomes a big deal, cities were being bombarded with artillery and cannons, those kind of things. And like the city of Vicksburg, the Union Army would siege around cities that were important. So they would just encircle the city and just kind of almost like starve them out and bomb them and fire artillery until they surrendered. And so this didn't only hurt soldiers now fighting on the field, but also hurt civilians now too. And so it's like these families had to survive this war and stuff as they were dealing with this idea of total war now. So whether you be in a city like Atlanta or in Vicksburg, as the army came through, you had to hide or escape or get out because your buildings, your houses, your homes, that kind of stuff could be destroyed. So like in Vicksburg, families lived in caves and trenches, those kind of things to survive. A lot of people starved because no food was coming in and out of the city. And I said, a lot of times houses like the big plantation houses down south were taken over as field hospitals or as headquarters. And so a lot of places were kind of, kicked out of their houses and kicked out of their homes, especially down south. And for up north as well, it's also the same problem. Like, people on the home front had to meet needs of their families, so a lot of prices went up. So as prices would increase for meat and food, those kind of things went to soldiers, prices went up for everybody else. So you have inflation across the country. You have war profiteering where people are trying to make money off of grain and those kind of things. Wisconsin, hate to say it became a very rich state because of the Civil War. We grew wheat here, and wheat was needed for bread and those kind of things for soldiers. Well, prices went through the roof, and a lot of farmers made a ton of money. But remember that as those prices went up, they also went up for regular people too. And so those people really struggled to support families and stuff happening here. And so you kind of see the idea of women wanted who was making stuff, and women getting a chance to be part of stuff and need people that would take care of businesses and all that kind of stuff as part of this. Information also changed a little bit too now. There's more information spread about the war than ever happened before. Newspapers, because of telegraphs and photographs and those kind of things, learn more about things than ever. And so the papers really shared a lot of information about the war, including casualty counts, showed pictures of combat. You knew who was fighting, and this is actually the deceased list that would come home and be put in towns. And remember, when these volunteers signed up, entire towns signed up to fight sometimes. So if you have a really bad battle where a regiment or a company is fighting, you could have half the men of a town eliminated in one conflict potentially because they all signed up for the same place. Which really changed how things are. And then you see this. You have the picture versus the sketch, and obviously the picture is a little more real as you see kind of the ending of a battle and all the dead bodies, those kind of things as part of the conflict that's here. It's just kind of more real and more real about the war and things that people are seeing. This leads up to our election of 1864, as President Lincoln runs against George McClellan, and some people called Copperheads actually wanted to sue for peace. They supported McClellan, who said he wanted to have peace and stop the war, whereas Lincoln said he wanted to see everything through. You can kind of see his campaign poster here for Lincoln, Abraham Africanus, the idea that he wanted to try the idea of freedom. We'll stop there.